The air was no longer air. It was a microscopic blade that scraped Elias's lungs with every painful attempt to breathe. At 80 years old, life had already taught old Elias patience and endurance, but nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the pure hostility of that environment. The landscape was not merely white. It was the abyss of whiteness, a void where the silence was so dense it seemed to crush the eardrums. And at the center of that frozen inferno, he stood. Elias was freezing at an unimaginable negative 71 degrees Celsius. The number, 71 degrees Celsius, was not just a meteorological statistic. It was a death sentence, a physical limit imposed by nature on human survival. At such temperatures, exposed skin suffers frostbite in less than 30 seconds, and breathing the air without proper protection irreversibly damages lung tissue. Elias, a man who knew the tricks of tundra winters like the back of his wrinkled hand, was about to lose his final wager against the climate. His fingers, even wrapped in sheepskin wool gloves and leather overmittens, had lost all sensation hours ago. He moved them uselessly, trying to create friction, a spark of heat, but it was like trying to light a fire with ice. The cold was insatiable, penetrating layers of thermal clothing, skin, muscle, until it began draining heat directly from the bone marrow. Elias knew he had entered the terminal phase. The treacherous drowsiness, the sweet promise of rest that hypothermia offers before shutting everything down. He was silently saying goodbye, closing his eyes beneath the tightened hood, when he felt a warm, urgent tremor beside him. Coda. Coda was more than a dog. He was Elias's last tether to this world. A robust Malamute husky mix with dense silver wolf fur, Coda was warmth given physical form. The sole reason Elias had managed to extend his life for a few more hours after the snowmobile failed, broken beyond repair, 3 days' walk from the nearest cabin. What Coda did in those critical moments, as death brushed Elias's face, transcends any rational understanding of animal instinct. It is an act of love and sacrifice you have to hear to believe, a story that redefines the fragile boundary between survival and unconditional loyalty, and one that will, inevitably, make you cry. Elias and Coda lived by choice in deep isolation, in the far reaches of interior Alaska, where civilization was little more than a distant memory, and winters were legends whispered in fear. Elias's wife had passed away 10 years earlier, and the promise he made to her, to never leave the land they loved, kept him there. Coda had been a gift, a puppy that grew into the old man's shadow and guardian. The trouble began with a sharp, dry sound. They were returning from a routine trap-checking expedition, a trip meant to last only a few hours. The snowmobile, old but reliable, coughed and died. Elias tried to fix it, his aged, slow hands battling frozen grease and metal bolts that burned on contact. In normal winter temperatures, it would have been an inconvenience. At 71 Cundis, it was a death warrant. He managed to erect a small emergency shelter, a thin tarp and a few reflective foil insulators. Coda curled in immediately, using his body as a natural radiator. But at 71 degrees, even body heat, especially from a dog, dissipates rapidly. Elias knew they had at most 12 hours before the fuel in the portable heater ran out, and the shelter's interior dropped to lethal freezing levels. The heater had stopped 3 hours ago. The tension grew with every breath. Elias tried to keep his mind occupied, thinking of old times, laughter, the smell of coffee in the cabin. But the cold was an insistent tyrant, demanding all his attention. He began to shake uncontrollably, violent spasms that consumed his last energy reserves. "Coda," he whispered, his voice thin and weak. "My good boy, it's over." Coda did not respond with a bark or whimper. The dog was acting strangely. He was agitated, digging uselessly at the frozen ground inside the makeshift shelter. His snout was raised, sniffing the frozen air with feverish intensity. Elias noticed the dog wasn't shivering. His energy was focused into something resembling human determination. Elias tried to reach the emergency bag to grab the last piece of high-calorie chocolate he'd saved, but his arms felt like they weighed a ton. His vision blurred. The white of the snow and the gray of the sky blended into a soothing haze, Cerebral hypoxemia was advancing, gently guiding his mind toward eternal sleep. "Go, Coda," he managed to hiss. "Go home. You can find the way." He was offering his companion the only chance at survival. The dog could run. He was fast and had the sharpest sense of direction Elias had ever known. But Coda stayed. The dog stopped digging. He moved, not to curl closer to Elias's feet, which would have been the natural heat-preserving instinct, but toward the shelter's opening. The wind howled outside with the ferocity of 1,000 wolves, carrying ice crystals that lashed the tarp. Coda sniffed the wind, released a low, deep, heart-wrenching howl, and then did something unthinkable. He moved away from Elias. The old man felt a cold panic that had nothing to do with temperature. His only source of warmth, his only companion, was leaving. Elias's heart shattered inside his frozen chest. He had tried to save him, but Coda was choosing freedom, individual survival. It was painful but understandable. Elias cried, tears freezing almost instantly on his cheeks. He closed his eyes, accepting the end. The cold now felt almost comfortable. The sharp pain was gone, replaced by total numbness. He thought of his wife, of the warmth of a fireplace, and prepared for darkness. Then he felt it. Not the gentle, warm touch Coda usually gave with his snout. It was a massive, sudden, desperate weight pressing against his chest and neck. Elias tried to open his eyes, and what he saw pulled him back from the brink of unconsciousness. Coda had returned. The dog had positioned himself strategically, covering Elias's face, the most vulnerable area when breathing ultra-frozen air, with his hindquarters and thick tail. And that wasn't all. Coda wasn't just curled up. He was locked in. He used his body as a living wedge, pushing Elias's back against the cold tarp and arching over him, creating a protective vault with his spine. Within that tiny space Coda had created, the temperature rose perhaps 5 or 10 degrees, enough to mean the difference between imminent death and desperate survival. The dog's warm, moist breath circulated around Elias's head. The old man realized the sacrifice. To protect Elias's head and torso, Coda exposed large areas of his own body, especially his paws and ears, to the brutal 71°C air. The dog was becoming a shield of flesh and fur against time itself. The shock, the adrenaline surge, and the outrage of seeing his friend suffer for him jolted Elias awake. "No, Coda! Get out! You'll freeze!" Elias tried to push the dog away, but his hands were useless. Coda only growled, a low, guttural warning. Not aggression. A command to stay still and accept the help. He was the guardian now, and his mission was to keep that vital flame alive, even at the cost of his own existence. Elias's mind, now clearer, began to process what had happened. Why had Coda left? What had he been sniffing? What made him return with such urgency and such an extreme tactic? Though motionless, Coda was tense. He trembled, not from cold but from focused effort. Suddenly the dog began licking Elias's face frantically, not as affection but as an attempt to force him awake, nudging his head slightly so Elias could look toward the tarp. Elias strained his vision. His frozen breath clouded everything, but he saw it. At the shelter's opening, where Coda had paused before returning, the dog had vomited a small piece of dried meat Elias had been saving. But the meat wasn't the point. It was what Coda had done with the loose aluminum foil insulator Elias had left on the ground. Using his mouth and paws, Coda had carefully pulled the foil apart, tearing it into strips and placing them under his own belly before lying over Elias. The dog was using thermal reflection, something Elias had tried to explain to him many times, to minimize heat loss through the frozen ground and maximize radiant heat toward Elias's body. It was an engineering tactic, driven not by reason, but by a love so pure and desperate it bordered on the miraculous. Coda wasn't just sacrificing himself, he was planning survival. The realization struck Elias like lightning. Pushed to his instinctual limits, the dog was demonstrating a level of intelligence and empathy that defied nature itself. He knew Elias needed concentrated heat. He knew where heat was being lost. and he used the few resources available, his body, his breath, and a piece of metal foil, to build a bubble of life. The damp warmth of Koda's body, mixed with the rhythm of his breathing, began to thaw Elias's eyelids. He could smell the dog's wet fur, the scent of wilderness and warmth, the smell of salvation. But the sacrifice carried a terrible cost. Koda's ears, exposed to the merciless wind, were beginning to show signs of necrosis. His trembling, though controlled, was constant. His caloric reserves were draining at an alarming rate. Elias was alive, but now Koda's pain was his own. Summoning what strength he had left, the old man managed to move his left arm and wrap it around the dog's protective body. "You're the best of all of us, Koda," he whispered. Koda whimpered softly, not in pain but in contentment. Mission accomplished. As night deepened, Elias felt one last stir in Koda's body. The dog lifted his head, sniffed the wind again, and let out 3 short, sharp, rhythmic barks. 3 barks, the emergency signal Elias had taught him, used only when spotting a vehicle or aircraft. But Elias knew there were no aircraft, not out there. He was slipping toward unconsciousness, cradled by his friend's sacrificial warmth, when he heard it, faint at first. A distant hum fighting against the wind's howl, a sound that didn't belong to the frozen wasteland. An engine. Koda had not only saved Elias from freezing using foil and his own body, he had used his desperate barking to guide a miracle. What Koda had smelled earlier at the shelter's opening wasn't just wind, but the faint scent of burning diesel oil carried from miles away. He knew someone was near. He had stepped away to signal, and returned to protect the treasure he was saving. Koda's warmth was the last and only flame. Elias survived, not by luck, but by the indomitable loyalty of a being who chose love over life. End of part 1. If you have ever loved an animal unconditionally, prepare yourself to share this tribute to loyalty that defied 71 degrees C. Leave your reaction in the comments, because there is more to be told about the price Koda paid for this heroic act.